Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to review everyone's favorite beach read, and that is War and Peace. To put it simply, War and Peace is about the French invasion of Russia in 1812, but I feel like, at least in pop culture, that this book is used as like the icon of not being a very social person or wondering what's wrong with the person reading a book like War and Peace. And I think because of that, my impression of it is actually stronger now that I've read it, because I feel like War and Peace, it is very long, but it's not, it is dense, but it's still readable, and I feel like it is very accessible. Ultimately, I do think that War and Peace is about the subjectivity of experience and the subjectivity of history. There's even a few parts in here where certain soldiers begin to tell their own war stories, and we have characters that acknowledge that they're likely embellishing the stories they're telling to sort of give that whole effect of glory and grandeur. Tolstoy himself even sort of critiques history, especially within the wars going on at this time in the early 1800s, and how it paints this picture of complexity of patriotism between France and Russia evenly. Throughout the story, there is this big sense of the actions that the characters are taking are unchanging, as if they almost really don't even have control over it, but what it also does is that it creates this sort of symbolic death towards life and especially towards innocence. And we seem to cycle through this repetition to where it feels like every time something does happen to these characters, it's this sort of purgatory where they constantly have to learn and reshape their own identities. For example, we have Andre, who's confronted with this sense of death and symbolism and innocence whenever he's wounded, and then he's lying on the ground and looking at the sky, and for the first time realizing the mortality of his life. We also have a character by the name of Nikolai, who's confronted by a Frenchman, and Nikolai can't really even believe at this moment that someone would want to harm him at all. We also have Pierre and his namesake, and how that's juxtaposed with his own quest for identity, and how he starts to think about the control and exposure he has towards violence. And finally, we have Natasha, who I think learns to let go of the very sacred moment of romance that she has when she's younger, and then eventually evolves to learning that life and love is infinite and it can be projected onto so many more people other than just a singular person. I think what I loved about reading War and Peace is that, again, with the idea of singularity and experience, is that it never felt like these characters had one specific moment of clarity, and instead it felt like just this snowball or domino effect of constantly having to learn and relearn and sort of prepare yourself for the next hurdle in your life, which I feel like mirrors real life so well, because in a way, we're never quite prepared for our obstacles until we're actually faced with them. And I feel like this rings so true with the last few hundred pages of War and Peace, because that's where the war is sort of at its peak, at least with the interactions between characters and the war. And it doesn't entirely feel like build up beforehand entirely either, which is good. As each character begins to sculpt their identity and sort of purpose in life, I've noticed that at least on one time or one occasion for each of these characters I've mentioned so far, that they all seem to dwell on the concept of happiness. Speaking of Andre again specifically, Andre, I would say, is quite cynical. Of course, a lot of things happen to him that cause him to be that way, but there's a specific point where he's talking to Pierre and mentions that happiness is the absence of suffering, but for Pierre, it's much more of a worldview where he sees that the world as a whole should be happy first before one can realize how happy they can become. It really made me wonder, with sort of these two binaries of happiness in place, whether or not happiness is entirely instinctive or it's a choice we deliberately make. And that goes back to a part, there's another character named Petya, and it's realized at a certain part of this book that entails Petya, that it talks about the joy of youth, and even whenever confronted with such violence and sadness that war can bring, there's something always about being young and knowing that something is on the cusp of something exciting about your life that could potentially happen, that makes you feel happy almost by accident or on impulse or instinct. And I think all of this about happiness becomes even more convoluted in this book because of the lack of a main character, as you've probably realized that I've thrown a bunch of names at you, but I think this is a great choice not to have a main character. I think it makes it all the more existential that happiness is not bound to narrative. It exists with no bias and is completely neutral to the world and could really care less about us. So before you cast off War and Peace as this pit of despair that I've seemed to describe it as so far, there are really lighthearted and humorous moments that I think really stick because I feel like it reflects so much about humanity and how we almost have this sort of accidental kinship with wanting to relate to other people. A few examples I have handy here of funny moments, I think, would be Natasha branding herself with a ruler. And I've already touched on this a little, but there is my silly and naive Nikolai who can't believe a Frenchman would ever want to harm him, of all people. And probably the icing on the cake for me is when Pierre ties a policeman to a bear. Humor seems to be a great antidote for a lot of the melancholy that definitely penetrates this story. Mainly, I would say, with the character Pierre especially. I think out of all the characters that Pierre's the one that in a way has like the most bad luck, I would say, but also the one I think that transforms the most and how he approaches people. And it's just a delight to watch. And it's also a delight with the other characters. But again, with how, speaking of with Tolstoy and how he thinks of history and how it's constantly being interrogated and reshaped and retold. I think it's the same with these characters, as I've mentioned, how they constantly relearn about themselves. And I know it's cheesy to say, but because of the sort of grandness of War and Peace, it almost feels like a disservice to even call this a novel, mainly because of Tolstoy's elements of including his own voice and how he thinks of history, but it's just, when I look at my other books, I feel like nothing quite compares to War and Peace. My reading experience of this book is one I'll definitely, I think of, or at least for a good while, compared to everything else I read at this point. But I will say also my final touch here is that with the many romantic pairings we're given, I feel like this last romantic pairing at the end was a bit surprising, but then I realized I think it reminds me of my own takeaway from this book, and I think it makes me remember to give myself my own permission to be constantly curious about the world. I feel like out of all the characters in this book, those two are most, like, I would say, foundational to that word curious. I think they have this curiosity and lust for life that sort of carries this story along, and it's such a delight to discover. I will say that despite enjoying reading this book, I will admit it was quite mentally exhaustive, so I'm going to go reward myself and go out and get a large cookie dough blizzard. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.